Hi, we continue today with the story in Luke 7:36-50, starting today in verse 40 with Jesus turning to speak to Simon, his host. So to set us up, we've been looking in this entire unit in chapter 7 and 8 to how it's framed by these two pairs of stories of a man and a woman, a man of high status and the woman of low status, with the centurion and the widow of Nain, and then down here with Jairus' daughter and the bleeding woman. Curiously, in the story we're on today, we have this exact same thing, a man of high status, Simon the Pharisee, and the woman of the city of obviously a lower status, although we don't know exactly what her status is, other than that she's not invited to Simon's house. And so in this whole unit in the middle here, we're looking at forms of resistance to trusting in Jesus in the way. And here is, of course, the fear of welcoming sinners to the table on behalf of Simon the Pharisee. And so we're also looking at it in the sequence of meal scenes. This is our second meal scene, and these first 5 meal scenes form a rough chiasm here, and the pair in the B sections here are both at the house of a Pharisee. And in the middle, of course, is a feeding where there's nobody's house at all, except God's house, the house of the earth. And while we're looking at these broader things, we're also looking at how this section is framed around changes in how people are described. So last time we saw how in this opening unit, which we looked at last time, the host is simply referred to as Pharisee, 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 and now that's gone, and it's Simon, Simon, Simon. And then we'll also see today how when Jesus turns to Simon to speak, turns to the woman but speaks to Simon, he repeats some of the green part here that we had the narrator tell us had happened, really emphasizing that and really putting emphasis on feet, which is an unusual phenomenon there. And we'll also see today how it frames the beginning and the end in this rough chiastic shape, that Jesus took his place at the table, and we weren't told at the time anybody else was there, but of course there had to be, and at the end it's confirmed that those at the table with him. And so we'll see that there also. Finally, while we're looking at the overall thing, we'll be looking in this section today at how Luke, in this uniquely Lucan section, uses some rare words that only he uses or hardly ever used elsewhere. And we see those in the little parable that Jesus tells. Maybe it's not a parable, maybe it's just a hypothetical that Jesus offers to Simon as a way to get him to respond. So let's go back and look here at, actually let's have it here with the key words, and then we'll go look at how our story unfolds. So one of the things that's, I think, important to see, we'll look at key words, and last time we looked at the cultural context that helped us to understand why a very common misunderstanding of the story of the woman of the city having her hair down implies that she's a prostitute, and what was much more likely, as we saw last time, is that she's somebody grieving, and of course her tears express that. She's certainly not offering herself to Jesus sexually in this context, even though what she's doing is blatantly erotic, touching and kissing his feet, etc. But this is not primarily a sexual situation. It's a situation of someone who is trying to express love to someone through whom she experiences forgiveness. But in the story that follows here from verse 40 to 50, one of the interesting things are not the individual words as such, but the strange jumps in logic and the responses within the cultural context. Just to set that in mind here. So in the last verse, we saw that the narrator told us what was in Simon. We're about to find out his name is Simon. We didn't know yet. What's in his head? He said to himself, if this man were a prophet. But then we see in verse 40, Jesus, it says spoke up, but the actual word in the Greek here, apokristos, means having answered. So Jesus answering the thoughts that are in Simon's heart. But does Simon know that's what Jesus is doing when he simply invites an open-ended, I have something to say, and then tells this little strange story about a creditor and 2 debtors. And in the meanwhile, the woman is continuing to cry and kiss his feet throughout this whole time. As we find out later, since I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. So while he's turning to her and speaking up, this is all going on. And so it's very strange, and we'll see as we go on that the responses are also strange. So Luke is telling us something that leads us to want to read between the lines at several levels there. So not so much the individual words today, but the logic of the story is what I want to focus on. So Jesus answered and said, Simon. How he knew his name, I guess you would know the name of someone who's inviting you, but he must have known before we did. And then he just offers this general invitation, I have something to say to you, which in this context of a meal, especially a meal that we know, of course, has other people there, could be a potential honor challenge. for two men to speak to each other. Perhaps Jesus is going to challenge him with a question, or perhaps Jesus is going to see if he knows something, or put him on the line somehow. Even the most seemingly innocuous exchanges can involve public honor, and if Simon can't respond, then he would be dishonored. So Jesus, in fact, being polite by suggesting, I have something to say, and I'm waiting for you to agree that it's okay for me to speak, rather than just speaking up, which he normally just does. He just speaks up. And yet the response is, teacher, speak. Teacher is a common title for Jesus, and yet it's almost always negatively. We saw it earlier negatively, and it's for, especially in light of earlier in this chapter, both the narrator and the character refer to Jesus as Lord. And that's certainly one of the right answers. But in this particular case, this shows there are a number of parallels between this story and one that perhaps is more familiar to many people, setting up the so-called Good Samaritan story. Let's look briefly at just some of the parallels there and consider why Luke might have set it up this way. So you see between 740 and 50 and then 1025 to 37, we see these connections. In this one, Jesus is with a Pharisee, and that one he's with a lawyer. But as we'll see, and I'll show you again in a minute, when we look at who the Pharisees are with throughout Luke, other than this scene, they were with lawyers before and lawyers next. So they're can be seen as a combined group, and they often are. So with a Pharisee here and a lawyer next, both places they call him teacher. Jesus responds to that with a story about love or mercy with a choice at the end. So we have the story of the creditors here and the story of the Good Samaritan there. And in both cases, the opponent responds rightly using the Greek word orthos, and it's only used one other time where it's used against Jesus, whereas opponents say, we know you speak rightly. And so they give the right answer, and Jesus' response is to call to move from right answers to right action, to go and do likewise, or here, to suggest to experience forgiveness more is to love more, like the woman is modeling for Simon. So we'll see how this model of how to challenge some of these religious leaders will come out again later. So moving back to our logic, after Simon says, go ahead and speak, we hear this. And notice how it just comes completely out of nowhere here, as my note suggests. A certain creditor, one of the unique words, doneste or moneylender, had two debtors. And again, so you're with Simon at the table here, and there's this woman doing this outrageous stuff, and Jesus knows what's on Simon's mind, and suddenly tells this little riddle about debtors. And it's not obvious at all, unless you already know the ending of what's going on there. And he said one owed 500 denarii, which is an unbelievable amount. As a kind of standard form for an ordinary working person, 1 denarius a day at the time would have been a standard wage. And so someone to owe 500 denarii means a member of the elite. To get in that much debt, a year and a half's worth of debt for an ordinary working person, must be someone of much wealth and property. And the other, a tenth as much, which is still plenty. That's still plenty of debt. I mean, imagine if you owed a month's wages or more. Maybe you do something like a mortgage or a car payment, that kind of thing. And yet, that part's not unusual, other than the huge amount of debt. But what happens in Jesus' little scenario is shocking. When they could not pay, the normal response would be expected. They had them arrested and put in jail until they could pay. You're not going to just let them get away with it. Or maybe if they were generous, they gave them more time, or reduced the interest, or something reasonable like that. What you would not expect is, oh, you can't pay? Well, never mind. I'll cancel the debt altogether. I mean, imagine our world if someone couldn't pay their mortgage or some other thing, and the bank just said, forget it. We'll just wipe off your mortgage. I mean, it's a shocking, counterfactual reality, and that's not even what happens in the story in terms of the response generating, what are you talking about? So Jesus presents both the huge amount of debt in the contrast, and then the seemingly impossible situation of where the creditor would release the debt. And then he asks the question out of that, which one of them will love him more? Using agapeo, which is something that Luke uses in contrast with some of the other synoptics. And as scholars have noted, using the verb agapeo, the noun form agape, in the context of patronage was not unusual in the Greco-Roman world. But it's unusual in the New Testament otherwise, where agape is about interpersonal relationships based on self-giving. And so the idea that someone would love based on canceling debts, just as the elders in the beginning of the chapter said that the centurion who built their synagogue loves our people. Collectively, Luke uses agape or agapeo that way a number of times. And so in Jesus' mouth we hear that to Simon, which one of these whose debts were released will love him more? And Simon, seemingly hesitant to fall into a trap, uses hupo lambano here. It's only in the parallel also. That's one of the things that led me to see the connections as well as in Acts. He's hedging his bets and giving what is obviously the right answer, and Jesus says it's the right answer. But then we get into the scene that gets even more amazing. Simon might be thinking, what's the point? Why are you asking me this question? It's obvious, isn't it, that the person who would have a greater debt relieved would be more grateful, or, in your words, love more. So what's your point? And then we see this. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon. And this might involve some imagination to see how they're turning. Remember, the woman was washing his feet from behind, and you saw in the Rubens picture that I showed last time, maybe one way to imagine that. But now he's turning toward her and speaking to Simon, whom he's not looking at. And notice he doesn't explain the debt little analogy or what the point of that was. It's not referred to again at all. And what he does now is completely dishonoring to Simon. But it also involves revealing what we didn't know, that Simon was deeply dishonoring to him as a host. And so rather than discuss the question of whether the woman is a sinner, he turns to a conversation about comparative hospitality, which really seems like it's changing the subject. So let's look more precisely at what he has to say here. Do you see this woman? Or literally, are you looking at this woman? And that, I think, is really the key to the whole story, and often why more patriarchally oriented, or unconsciously so, male interpreters have often read the story through the lens of Simon, asking what kind of woman this is and seeing her as a prostitute or something like that. Whereas Jesus is saying, do you see this individual person? Not a woman in a category, but this woman in particular, who's now kissing me and crying all over my feet. But that's not even what he focuses on. He focuses now on the contrast with what's gone on while we've been watching. I entered your house, and we highlighted at the beginning that the narrator telling us that was showing he was entering into what for a Pharisee would be the sacred realm, a realm alternative to the temple as a holy place. So entering in your house, you gave me no water for my feet. Now that would not be required, it's not mandatory, but it's certainly what a good host would do. But she has bathed, or literally rained on, as we heard the narrator say, my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. It's certainly not suggesting that Simon should be doing that, but the contrast is sharp. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. And again, the extremity of that is just remarkable. She has not stopped kissing my feet, presumably throughout the meal and whatever else has been going on here. And then finally, you did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. And I haven't looked at all the individual words here, but you could see from the chart before that I put up that many of these are unusual words. So 3 times in front of Simon's guests, Jesus is blatantly dishonoring his host and saying, you are a terrible host. You invited me to your house and you did nothing that hospitality calls for. But this woman who you are looking on so badly has provided extravagant hospitality, and it's not even her house, and she wasn't even invited. And then he reaches this point here. We see this is one of many and few contrasts in Luke. You see later with harvest and harvesters, or lashes and others as well. So therefore, he says, or literally, ukaran, because of, I tell you, her sins, which were many, notice past tense, not present tense, which were many, have been forgiven. Hence, she has shown great love. And we want to underscore that because, as a feminist scholar recently, Kylie Crabb, has noted, many scholars, especially male scholars, have suggested that the forgiveness comes in verse 48 when Jesus says to her, your sins are forgiven. But it's plain that Jesus is saying she's loving because she already experienced forgiveness. And that's what we hear here. Her sins, which are many, have been forgiven. Hence, she has shown great love. The love she is showing is because her sins have been forgiven. And that happens just simply by her trusting that coming to Jesus was a safe place, that her love poured out would be experienced as gift, as it obviously has been. So the forgiveness did not require words from Jesus' mouth, although they come, and then we'll see the objection to that, but she knew it just in walking into his presence. And her response is to show great love. And then the kicker comes, but the one to whom little is forgiven loves little. And note how this plays out against what we saw in the Sermon on the Plain. What credit is there if you love only those who love you? And so to love enemies. But we didn't imagine that the capacity to love would be based on how much one is forgiven. And to focus that a little more, we need to look a little more closely at the words for forgiven, because in English, perhaps people hear forgiveness as something that requires saying, I'm sorry, and engaging in a whole process. And it certainly can mean that, and sometimes that's exactly what's appropriate. But sometimes not, because Jesus certainly doesn't call for a confession, and she doesn't say any words throughout this whole thing. So you need to recognize there are three different Greek words that are translated as forgive in some places in the New Testament. One, apoluo, which often simply means to loosen. And so it can mean divorce here, or release in this kind of context, or to be sent away. But in the Sermon on the Plain, it can mean forgive, and you will be forgiven, as you saw there. And then the word that's at issue here, because here's our current scene, forgive, aphiemi, can simply mean to let go. Not in that sense of release, but in the sense of something you're holding on to. And so, as in they left everything and followed him, or the fever left her, or take out the speck of your eye, or did not allow anyone to enter, the negative of that, went away and let it alone. So I want to underscore all the uses of this verb for things other than forgive. So we can hear it simply of to let go. And there's also the noun form, aphesis, forgiveness here, but it also means release, as we saw in the Jubilee proclamation back in chapter 4. So when Jesus says to Simon here, the one to whom little is forgiven, the one who has little of what they have against them, their sins let go of, loves little. But at this point, I'd like to provide a little bit of wisdom from the great feminist biblical scholar Wendy Farley, who notes this. If we hear in this passage only a message of forgiveness, we remain in the world of the Pharisee. The unrighteous might be forgiven, but they remain outside the world of decent behavior. They do not come to our parties. To see with the eyes of Christ, however, we must imagine that before she entered the house, she experienced affliction that is interpreted by the Pharisee as sin. But Jesus sees something else, and in seeing it, awakens in her a hemorrhage of love and crazed gratitude. I think Farley really gets to the point, as she so often does in her work, that this was one of the key reasons that Luke will provide for table fellowship, as it means both in actual table fellowship and in theoretical table fellowship, with several stories about when you have a banquet, who do you invite, to highlight that it's one thing to accept people at a distance, another thing to accept them up close. So in our story, this woman is as close to Jesus as she could possibly be in public, with her hair and her hands all over his feet, and the conclusion, your sins are forgiven. Now, that's not quite the end of the story, though. Wouldn't it be nice if it had a happy ending there? But, of course, it's not having a happy ending quite. It goes down to this. But those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Notice they're saying it among themselves, so whether that's saying it out loud in a way Jesus can hear, we don't know. Presumably it's not that big a room, so if he can understand what's going on in Simon's heart, he can certainly understand what's going on in them. But he pays no attention to it. Doesn't respond to it at all. And notice that Simon says nothing. Even though Jesus publicly dishonored him, and this woman has been, whether in the symposium sense of the unexpected guest as a stock character, or as simply someone who shows up at his meal and disrupts things, he's restrained himself substantially. It's surprising he has. But the people with him do ask the question, which Jesus does not respond to. He's been asked this question already back in chapter 4, or beginning of chapter 5. And so it ends this way, and he said to the woman, speaking to her directly now, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Using piston here, as we saw earlier, and I like to translate it, even though New RSV has it as faith and most do, your trust. That pistis in this noun form meant trust or confidence, an active sense of believing in somebody. And the way we might say we believe in somebody, that you can count on them to be there for you when you need them. It's your faith has saved you or made you well. Sozo is often used for made well. Go in peace. And this is the first time we hear Jesus say, "Go in peace," but it really summarizes what the whole gospel is about. Is it trusting that forgiveness and fresh start comes in Jesus? One does that, pours out one's love, and that enables, in Farley's words, a hemorrhage of love and crazed gratitude to flow forth, which allows one to live in the true peace that, in John's gospel's language, the world cannot give nor take away. See you next time for the women who come to support Jesus in this mission in the beginning of chapter 8. Bye-bye.